two Jamo, and then Malasana, Damo, Georgi, by the attitude, Sons, Ninja Jamur, two Jambola, Sons, so a Tani, then Consum Dom, Jamsochi, then Consum de Sentin Tangi, then Dumarji, Jamsochamo, 2,000 Dumala, and Jamsochamo, so.
As we have heard before, to the one who is endowed with great compassion, I pay homage. This is how Atisha, the author of our text, starts out by way of prostrating, of paying homage to the great compassionate one, Avalokiteshvara, otherwise also known as Chenrezig. He then continues with the first sentence of the first verse, continuing with the text itself, in which he speaks of the great offering, of the great ocean of suffering of the three rungs. And this indicates that the entire world, the entire cycle of existence, no matter where you go, no matter where you look, is characterized by being suffused, by being completely pervaded with suffering. That is the fundamental condition. At the time when the teacher of our present age, the Buddha of our age, the Buddha Shakyamuni, resided at the site of his enlightenment in India, in Bodh Gaya, he was eventually approached by the great gods of Brahma and Indra and their great retinue of 84,000 different gods and types of beings, etc. And he was asked by them repeatedly to teach the Dharma, to turn the wheel of teaching, to teach the instructions that lead to enlightenment. Having been approached by the gods and their retinue of many different types of beings in this way, the Buddha then considered which would be the right place to give the first teaching. And he entered a great meditative absorption, he entered a samadhi, and in that samadhi he looked at which would be the appropriate place for his first teaching. And he saw in that samadhi that the previous Buddhas of this age, the three Buddhas that had preceded him, which had appeared in this world, which are named Korvajik, Sertup, and Ösong, that all of these three Buddhas had delivered their first teaching at a place called Varanasi. And therefore the Buddha decided that this would also be the appropriate place for him to give his first teaching, and he went to that place. Having decided accordingly, the Buddha then proceeded to this place of Varanasi, where, as he arrived there, spontaneously a throne that appeared as if being supported by lions, etc., appeared, upon which he sat down. At this moment also the first students of the Buddha, the first 5 students of the Buddha, appeared at this particular site of his first deliverance of the teaching, who had a karmic connection with the teachings of the previous Buddhas. These were also the people who received the first ordination from the Buddha in this particular manifestation. And the Buddha then proceeded to deliver the teaching of the 4 truths. And the first of these 4 truths which he taught is the truth of suffering, the fact that all samsaric existence, no matter of which sort, is suffused, is pervaded by suffering. In that regard, it is necessary to be endowed with the resolve to become free of suffering and the causes of suffering. Now, if one were to examine the various kinds of rebirths that one could take on within this cycle of existence, if one were to subdivide them into various modes of existence, we could, for instance, use the 6 classes of beings, the 6 types of beings or existence as they're usually being taught. Now, if we were to examine each and every one of these closely, we would invariably come to the conclusion that none of these various modes of existence is entirely free of suffering. Now, that being the case, we then resolve to find a way out of that cycle, cycle of suffering, of existence, of constant rebirth within either of these 6 modes of existence, and we resolve strongly to find a way out of there to become free of such suffering. Having made that resolve, having decided that this is what we want to do, we then start out to look for ways to become free of such suffering and the causes thereof. Now, in order to give rise to such resolve, it is necessary that we first examine the various modes of existence as to their shortcomings, as to the various types of suffering there are. We have to examine all the various 6 types of rebirths that we could possibly take on within this cycle of existence, and examine them as to what particular sorts of suffering one has to undergo in each of these. If we were to examine the sufferings of the various realms, of the various 6 modes of being, then we would start out by way of examining the very worst of them, which is the realm that is also commonly known as the hell realms. Within these hell realms, there are predominantly 2 types of suffering, which are the predominant feature or characteristic of these hell realms. There's either suffering of extreme heat, or on the other hand, there's suffering of extreme cold. If we were to imagine the suffering of extreme heat, we could, for example, imagine how we ourselves would find ourselves in a red-hot iron chamber, or even in a multiple red-hot iron chamber. In the very midst of this raging fire, of this raging heat, we would undergo extreme, unspeakable suffering. And on the other hand, we could imagine the suffering of extreme cold in the cold hell realms, as if we would find ourselves stark naked in a snow or icy desert in a glacier, and would undergo the suffering of extreme cold. Such, and of all sorts of other types of this particular kind of heat or cold, are the sufferings that are being undergone by beings which find themselves reborn in the hell realms. Now, presently, the hell realms are not visible to our naked eye. We have no direct evidence that these hell realms truly exist. Nevertheless, we have the credible statement by none less but the Buddha himself, who has seen such worlds, who has seen such realms and such in unspeakable suffering from the depths of his meditative absorption, of his samadhi. Therefore, we could decide to trust the words of the Buddha, to put our confidence, to put our trust into what the Buddha has taught, and at least consider the possibility of such realms, of such worlds of suffering truly existing. Now, even though, as Rinpoche already said, such hell realms and their sufferings are not immediately visible to us, nevertheless, it is possible even in a human existence to get at least a small taste of what it means to undergo such suffering of either extreme heat or extreme cold. There are some of us who have the karmic setup to be potential candidates for rebirth in the hell realms, however, have been reborn in the human realm and undergo at least a small fraction of such sufferings as they would be experienced in the hell realms. For instance, there are such different kinds of sickness or disease in the course of which the entire skin of a person peels off, and such a patient gets the intense feeling as if burning up internally and suffering from great heat. Or there are others who experience in their human body the suffering of great cold. These are indeed intense sufferings, extremely unpleasant experiences. However, they are just the tiniest fraction of whatever suffering of heat or cold would be experienced if we were born in the hell realm. Now, we are, particularly in the West, are in the lucky position to benefit from all sorts of medical care and all sorts of medical science. So for that reason, such sufferings can, for the most part, be alleviated very quickly. Nevertheless, they give us a small taste of what it could mean to be born in such a hell realm and to undergo even unspeakably greater suffering of such sort. On the other hand, there are the various practitioners of the various types of healing arts, regular conventional medicine, homeopathy, all other sorts of healing methods that are being practiced by all sorts of individuals. These could be viewed as the result of the positive prayers and aspirations of previous Buddhas, of Bodhisattvas and Buddhas that have made such aspiration in the past. It is the result of their aspirations and prayers for the sake of beings that such possibilities of being healed of one's sicknesses, etc., do exist in the first place. Another realm of suffering is that of the so-called Pretas or hungry goats, and that particular type of rebirth as such a type of being is characterized by the intense suffering through hunger and thirst. We have to imagine to be reborn in such a realm and for years on end not to find anything to eat or anything to drink, and needless to say that the suffering that derives thereof would be extremely intense indeed. The suffering within the animal realm is mainly characterized by fear, the fear of being eaten by another animal. And indeed, if we look at the animal realm, for the very most part, this is the case. The larger animal eats the smaller animal, the smaller one eats the next smaller one, etc., and so forth. It never stops. If one were to imagine what sorts of different animals there are, we only have to imagine the extreme vastness of the oceans. All different sorts of animals are there, and it's impossible to say how many different sorts they are, but they're all characterized by the one thing, which is that they eat each other. And of course that they suffer from the fear of being eaten from each other. So this is one of the predominant fears of the animal all of which brings us to the human realm, in which we ourselves find ourselves presently. And the human realm is predominantly characterized by 4 types of suffering. The very first of these is the suffering of birth, which fortunately most of us do not remember. However, the suffering that we're very much aware of is the suffering of aging. And as we age, as we continue to get older, our seeing fails, our hearing fails, our legs don't do their job anymore as we would wish them to do. And on top of this, we might also suffer from all sorts of sicknesses. We might have to go to the hospital, we might see all the other sick people there, etc., and so forth. And eventually, what's at the end of all of this? It's death, of course. So in this way, all human birth, all human life is characterized by the 4 predominant sufferings of birth, old age, sickness, and eventually death. Now, as if that weren't enough, there's lots of other suffering as well in the human realm. All of us know from personal experience that we often suffer from all sorts of discord with family members or other loved ones or friends. All sorts of fights and misunderstandings constantly happen, all sorts of conflicts, etc., happen all the time, which for the most part, are an expression of yet other types of suffering, or sometimes loved ones may get sick, we have to take care of them, we see their suffering, which in turn depresses ourselves, and so forth. There's just no end to any of this suffering. So in this way, on top of the 4 predominant types of suffering within the human realm, there are lots and lots of other sufferings as well.
That's a mama, Rochimbo, Yamaka Kaga, Matamchila, the Nichikela, Sana, Zewatam, Zewati, and Tembo Yondo. Zewa Tembo. Mata, Gebotamchi. Tembo. They call on Sona, and Tuba, they call you, Naruto Chipai. Yena young, Tuba Honayo. I'm to wait on I don't take a jail as Zapanda was it, Zawanda was it, then it is in Messi on the dirty. Then it Daganga Lord Chamburin, that home down, take the lapa, take it in, then give a game on the drawing the one.
However, there are some rare examples, for the very most part, elderly people who show us that also a different way can be practiced. It's mostly such people who have a lot of experience of having lived together, of having gone through all types of misunderstandings and differences of opinion. However, who have not allowed this to drive them apart, who have lived through this, who have found a way to manage their differences and have grown old together like this. So this is a very heartening example that we all should take to heart.
Anything so? There's not that low chance on Tangi. There's an chance on drawing though. That Jeremy, Jerome on Namata, Yondo, Young Chipozi, any Narana, don't choose sure. Any young to see. Bemazi Chipo, Charon Tongo, Chipondo, I don't Sam Gavon. Diane, Lord Jima Jairina, Diane Kun, Taking Nasa Jay Leona, Jay Yore, Jay Yoma, Nas, Charopa Hari, so. Ropa Leka, let my song, and they are on the other song. What then our days it is not in the yesterday. Also, Kakatendo, you do too short. Then you Kakajungo, Kakatendo, that is some matters talking.
Now, opposed to that example, which says he's quite concerned about us considerably younger ones whom he continuously meets here. One year, a young couple comes along, meets Rinpoche, everything is nice and they love each other, and they tell Rinpoche, here we are, we practice the Dharma together, and isn't it all very nice? And Rinpoche says, yes, indeed it is. And he's happy for all of them. And then the next year, only one of the two turns up. And Rinpoche, of course, being naturally concerned, he asks what happened to the other one. And the person then says, oh yes, that other person, yeah, well, we had so many differences, we were fighting so badly, so we've split up a long time ago. So that way, that type of behavior, that way of dealing with each other, which is very predominant among younger people, concerns Rinpoche quite a bit.
Zepachi Gandena, the Preta, Dane, Aram Zepa Gom Tobari, Zepa Gamba, Dane, and so Dachamo Sawi. True the mena, Trupa Jimmy Yomari, Trupa Majan, Zepa Gambi Yomari. He had two sons in a Pemas Yapuri. Jitting as soon as the legend of Matanji, and the Kuni Tenti Yapondo, Tayan Rimbonondo, Diesel Tenti Yapondo. Then the Yapondo, Labri, Jimba Tonji, Kuni Rimbonondo, Diesel, Tata Yondo, Yore Koruni, Yapondo, Zode.
Now, that being the case,
Zepagambala, Zewa Samba Sevi, Gewachego, Top. Majamba Tanji, Yapodos, Tepado Corteon, Top. And Marani, you need to send Chipo Young, pay up you.
Okay, we start. All right,
something with
friendship, relationship. Considering all of these points, considering all of these points, it is evident that it makes a great deal of sense that one should actually make an effort to keep up one's friendships, to keep up one's relationships, because indeed there is great blessing, there's great inspiration in that, and to keep up such a sort of relationship is indeed a very great gift. If we would not have the partners with whom we could fight, well then, with whom could we practice patience? Therefore, if we have such a partner, and we have differences occasionally, and we do fight occasionally, well, that is a gift in itself. Of course, if there were no fight going on occasionally, if there were no discord or misunderstandings or whatever else, well, then there would be no opportunity for us to practice patience. So in this way, it actually turns out to be very much like a blessing in disguise. If we can find it within ourselves in such moments, in such situations, not to just throw it all to the winds and up and leave, but practice patience in the face of such difficulties, then indeed this will be very beneficial, not only for ourselves, but also for others. We ourselves become the cause for others to rejoice, others who see us with our long-term partners, having gone through whatever difficulties we have, still together. Others will rejoice and say, look at these two. They've been together for so long, they've gone through so many difficulties, yet they still stick together. Isn't that nice? Isn't that a very wonderful thing? And in this way, we not only benefit greatly ourselves, but also become an inspiration to others. Others will look to us as good examples of how to deal with each other, how to deal with the difficulties and problems that invariably arise in a relationship, and they will take ourselves as their example, which in turn again becomes a cause for our own rejoicing.
라이방고 장진 이
순투자성 그네
송주자송선의 딘낭라 유바인의 탱가 유바 연카시
순투자성도 저때 하이 공부 야지 나 통과를 그 땅에 요로
그래서 이제 강가의 딘낭라 유를 자리 딘낭
강가 자리 딘낭라 요리 타네 사만 이거 거르도 다 제동 제 대한쇼 민다 예고 민족 틀린 사람 다 대표 와 그니 옛날거 내가 온거 나가니 자서 다 사만이 자네 다마 부르고 다 지라但당지 그 다동 당동 생각나면 나는 그래서 그분이 하만이 당지 뭐 밤지네 내 양수는 정도
그래 라 콘소랑 도바자고 그래 콘소 대가서 레지 왕고 그래 라 콘소 파 도바자고 그래
난다 레공 그래 하만이 야 도바자고 그래 사마 도바자고 그래
그래서 라 콘소랑 파
영마 도바자고 그래 하만이 마 밥사도 야 하고 마 당지 마 영네 그래서 그분이 마 밤네 장수 그 천рам라 하고 마 당지 거네 아니 하만이 장수 전에 잔을 찰 대상에 버리더니 양 레가 온 그다지 저도 하나 펌버를 주지 하만이 잡을 주지 저 양사正常 요야 버들이 근데 지라 하만이가 막 대용 그래 다 된다 다봐 탑스게 이제
The next drum is that of the demigods, or non-gods as they're literally called, also known as the Asuras. They're not humans anymore, but not quite gods yet, somewhere in between. And their Ram, or the rebirth in such a Ram, is characterized by constant fear and frustration. It is said that the troops of the Asuras constantly try to lay siege to the city or the Ram of the 33 gods of the Desire Ram, who are said to have their residence on top of Mount Meru, the central mountain of this universe. So somehow they managed to clamber up that mountain and to surround the city of the gods, which is surrounded by an iron wall, and they threaten the gods with utter distinction, with complete destruction, and whatever, should they ever dare to venture out of their walls. However, whenever they're just about to realize their goal, then thunderclaps are heard from the skies, or voices that says that all the demigods, all the Asuras will be destroyed, and a great rain of weapons of all imaginable sorts rains down upon them, so that they hurtle down the sides of Mount Meru and eventually drown in the great oceans that surround Mount Meru. So, and their Ram, or a rebirth in such a Ram, is constantly characterized by great fear of annihilation, and also of the frustration of their goals just in the very moment before their realization.
Then line is a Javan, Nusan or Rinpoche, Yaye Konyori. Then Samana Marukan, Nabatanji, Rangi, then I left younger, the Lapala left younger. Then Kola, then a higher bottom for Tangi, 2,000 Shabro jet, and Yin Yamutan. That then they keep us on Sobayori.
And then finally there's the God Ram. Now, apparently, for all intents and purposes, the God Ram is being characterized by constant happiness and well-being. Living in the God Ram, being reborn in the God Ram, one doesn't really have to go to any trouble to find foods, to bring about one's livelihood. Whatever food one desires, it spontaneously and instantly appears in front of one. Whatever drink one desires, likewise happens. The surroundings are utterly pleasant. One lives in great mansions and palaces, beautiful parks and gardens. There is the constant sound of laughter and singing and dance and merriment and so forth. So, for all intents and purposes, the rebirth in the God Ram is a very pleasant one. It is being brought about predominantly through great generosity, through having practiced the giving of alms to needy ones, having practiced the extending of help to those who are in need and help, etc. So it is a rebirth that is being brought about through the accumulation of great merits. This does not necessarily mean that the practice of generosity by all means leads to a rebirth in the God Ram. If we practice generosity with the explicit wish that through my practicing generosity may I enjoy the happiness and enjoyments of the God Ram in the future, if that is our driving, our predominant driving force behind our practicing generosity, well then a rebirth in the God Ram, in the God Rams is very possible. But this has nothing to do with true bodhicitta, with the true enlightened attitude. If we practice generosity in any other kind of virtuous deeds with true bodhicitta at the bottom of our hearts, with the wish to truly bring about benefit for the welfare of others, and at the same time have no regard for ourselves while doing so, have no particular hope at the bottom of our hearts that such virtuous deeds may result in happiness and enjoyments, etc. for ourselves, well, then we do not necessarily need to expect to be reborn as God. Then Koronga make any manjiting then high making he then Jiti Tangi Tonga, Yarway, Nigget and Satung Ganga Koron Tongando. Yeah, Tani Tanga, Machipu, Tanga, then Shedi, Tanya, and Runji got in the chimbo, the top of the Ningasan, then Koron, Hanchapo Tonga, Donga, Donga, Yendon Tan, Mandrawa, then Donga, Yankin Bornyon, then Shadow. Now, however, one has managed to be reborn in the God realms, all of that positive merit which has brought about such a birth will invariably, of course, be exhausted one day. And as soon as that is the case, there will be unmistakable signs for any individual God that the time in the God realm is drawing to a close, that the time of death is approaching. Such signs for a God who is on the verge of death are that, for instance, all the attendants and offering gods and goddesses who heretofore have been offering song and dance and flowers, etc., that they just do not turn up anymore. All of that pleasant sound that suffuses the God realm is all of a sudden not being heard anymore by such a God. Their own bodies, which have been youthful and beautiful and been emitting fragrant scents, etc., all of a sudden starts to smell unpleasantly. Their clothes, which have always been beautiful and nice, all of a sudden turn old. And all of these signs and many others are unmistakable signs of imminent death. However, at that particular point, a God being still has the ability, has a certain clairvoyance, and has the possibility to look down into the lower realms, as there is no higher realm. They are already at the very peak of the existence. There is consequently no other way but downwards. And they can see all the way down to the hell realms, where there is the suffering of intense heat and cold, etc., as well as all the other sufferings in the other realms. And in this moment, when they become aware of the fact that they will invariably be reborn in one or the other of these realms, which are so extremely inferior to the God realm, in this moment they're being gripped by extremely intense panic and fear, and they know that now this their time in the God realm draws to a close, and that they can only go down the ladder of various realms of existence, and that they will invariably experience whatever sort of suffering is in store for them.
Then shoot it on the Tatangarong, drop Motobaretaga, Nominga Nona, Kipuga Nona, Mrs. Zongo. Tate Zongo, Tatan Dandrava, then a rectu, Dungan Corvin, Nigga, Dungan Tangila, Sonote, Tangna, Naran, Tata, Milutoba. They say, 2 days and I don't drop Google. Corvin needed a tabby Google do some. Tenga song younger. They young get cheated,
Now, why talk about all of this? Presently, we're all well, we found ourselves in pleasant surroundings, the sun shines, more or less. We have good food, there are friends of ours, and we basically enjoy a good time. So now why on earth concern ourselves with all of these points? We should concern ourselves with these points because we have to find a way to motivate ourselves to concern ourselves with the Dharma in the first place. And in order to do so, we would be well advised to set aside at least a little bit of time to contemplate the hard facts of life. Presently, things may be quite nice, may be quite pleasant, but if we think about it, it is evident that things could be a lot worse. And presently, we find ourselves in a human existence, and in this one, we have the possibility to think about the causes of our being human, think about the causes of our experiencing happiness and pleasant circumstances, and think about the causes of possible suffering, etc., and so forth. So if we were to do so, that would indeed be very helpful, and that would motivate us as to finding ways of eventually experiencing true freedom, finding ways out of this cycle of constantly recurring suffering, finding a way of becoming free of all of that once and for all. Concerning the texts on which Rinpoche bases his teaching, we have now more or less covered the first two lines of the first verse, in which it says very clearly that the waves of the great ocean of suffering, etc., that these waves of the suffering of the three realms are extremely agitated. So that is basically the meaning of which we have talked about in this last session that we have covered so far. So if there would be any questions concerning these points, we could go into a very few of them. Otherwise, we just call it quits for now.